It's been a really exciting 2 days. Jim, who just went, I also applied for the 2009 astronaut class, so it's nice that both of us are now working on this and excited to see Reed Wiseman fly on Artemis 2. So what I'd like to spend the next 10 minutes talking about is some mapping that we've done over 2 sites, actually a couple of different sites on de Gerlache Crater Rim. And I'm of the de Gerlache family. I need to switch to do de Gerlache, but I think there's a little bit of conversation about pronunciation. So I want to thank my colleagues here. I've got a couple of students who've done this mapping this semester. Isaac Hollingsworth, Chapel Bell, Sydney Beltran, and Tony Lamontia have done just an outstanding job. And then Alex Huff wasn't able to present. She's currently doing international travel, but I'm very excited to see her work maybe at a future meeting on some tactical mapping. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, so to get us started for nested mapping, I pulled some images from my iPhone a few weeks ago because nested maps are so ingrained in our everyday life that we may not even realize that we're using them. This was a search that I did. The left image is I'm standing at the conference center at LPSC and I've done a search for coffee. And you can see that the map that's returned is going to help me make a decision about which coffee shop to go to. And there's lots of different options. And because the algorithm doesn't know if I'm on foot or if I'm by car, there's a lot of variation in the scale here. The red circle around the blue dot is myself, and that's a 2-kilometer radius circle, similar to what we'd expect Artemis 3 astronauts to be able to traverse. And once I've made a selection, I selected Blue Door Coffee. I know a lot of us do the same thing, and you can even see it was 11:09, so I was in between town halls. The moment that I make that choice, though, the map switches. Next slide, please. And now the map focuses on navigation. So we have maps here that help us do two things. They help us make decisions and they also help us navigate. For this talk, I'm going to focus on how maps help us make science decisions specifically. But I am really looking forward to future LSSWs where we can talk more about the navigation maps that we need to really help us with planning traverses. Next slide. Okay, so how do maps help us make science decisions specifically in support of Artemis 3? I picked out 3 of the science investigations. There's so many of them, 60 to 80 different investigations, but I picked out 3 that I think are kind of critical in terms of the geology. So, fundamentally, what is the bulk composition of the moon, right? Depending on where we land, what are the units that we're going to be able to sample? What is the stratigraphy? So, how old are each of those units? And then how do the units overlap? So, what came first? What is older, what is younger, and what's the timing of different events in a landing site. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus mainly over the red box in this image. This is a quick map image that simply has the unified global geologic map on, and I've overlaid the landing sites onto that. To focus in on de Gerlache Rim 1 and de Gerlache Rim 2, we'll really be looking especially around that area where I've put a little red arrow. So I'm a stratigrapher, which means that I'm very interested in trying to get as much time covered in sampling as possible, right, to try to reconstruct the ages of units on the moon. And one unit that I'm especially interested in, and really it's one contact, is the contact here between the purple Imbrian Plains unit at that red arrow and the darker chocolate brown pre-Nectarian basin unit, because that potentially could span over 1 billion years of time on the moon. And if that extends into, for example, the de Gerlache Rim areas, that would be really exciting. And that's the type of question that we can answer when we're doing nested mapping. So we'll zoom in now and look at the area in the red box. Next slide. And this is what that area looks like. So this is Mike Barker's Hillshade DEM 5 meters per pixel, and I've put a couple of additional red arrows to show where we do have planar material that sort of embays against older Nectarian massif material, or older Nectarian terrains, signified by those little red arrows. And there's a corner there. I'm ever the optimist. So in that upper left corner of de Gerlache Rim 2, it looks like you could potentially have some embayed relationships. And I want to point out how different the left side of de Gerlache ejecta is from the right side. So as we look at this image, if you look at the left side of the ejecta blanket, it's very discontinuous. It looks like there are more possible impact melts or planar units within those. And then if you compare that to the right side of Gerlache, then that side is much more smooth, right? It appears, of course, this is a hillshade, so I don't quite want to use the word bright, but it definitely texturally appears very smooth. And there just seems to be a real difference there. Another thing that's happening here is we've got this secondary impact, so that's the Brill crater that impacts into De Gerlache. And we've submitted that name, by the way. That's not an official name yet, but that one's been submitted, named for Yvonne Brill, a Canadian American rocket scientist. So now let's look at what some of the mapping over this, what it tells us. Next slide, please. All right, so geologic mapping over all of these different units really brings out the contact between the terra mantling and plains unit, that upper left, those red arrows, against potentially the De Gerlache rim and ejecta units. And even within the sort of troughs and valleys, it looks like there's more more planar material that's very pitted, that's interesting, that we want to look at and want to understand. So then when we look across to Gerlach Rim 2, right, that single box, we have a shift from very discontinuous geology on the left side, or very discontinuous topography, really, to the right side where it becomes smoother. De Gerlach Rim 1, of course, is very smooth. I also want to point out that within De Gerlach crater, we are able to map some slumped blocks. So they look like little yellow ghosts in the sitting inside De Gerlach crater. There is a initial floor that then the Brill impact impacts into, and all of that we can see using the hillshade. And then supplementing the hillshade, we also use some 1 meter NAC mosaic imagery, 1 meter per pixel NAC mosaic images. All right, now let's zoom in and look at the two De Gerlach rim sites specifically. So next slide. Following this train of thought all the way in, again, as a stratigrapher looking for where we could have these very extensive age relationships, I can almost track it in right all the way to the upper left side of De Gerlach Rim 2. And let's go ahead and click next slide to see the units. And we have a variety of units across this particular landing area, or these particular landing regions. So I'm going to talk my way through these different units. That upper left red unit is that planar material that we can trace out elsewhere. The purple units here, um, these all have tone and texture variations. So even within a single ejecta blanket, if we zoom out, of course, with nested mapping, we can see, you can kind of just map it as a single ejecta blanket. But then as you zoom in, there's quite a bit of variation. So we felt pretty confident. Most of this mapping was done at a 1 to 5,000 or 1 to 8,000 scale, very similar to Hannes's maps that are in his publication, and then also that he showed earlier today. The ejecta units are quite different than what we see on the rim. So the rim gets a little bit more rugged, certainly a little bit steeper. And the interior of the rim has a series of different units. So those green units there are sort of showing how we go from more rugged terrain to just sloped wall units, very reminiscent of what we see on Mars and on other planets. Although here I find that the topography is really, really muted. It's actually it's very interesting. The lower right, you'll see a circle labeled 4, and that's a bench unit that we can see in the De Gerlache sloped wall. So here there's uh, something that's rugged. It looks like it's blocks that are sliding down that are certainly worthy of study. And the last thing that I'll point out here is the circles, the 1, 2, 3, and 4, those are 2-kilometer radius circles for potential landing sites. So when I started this talk, I mentioned that, we use maps to make decisions. And so here, even in just these potential 4 landing sites, there's a lot of decisions to be made and a lot of variety in the science to be done. So for example, if you land at site 1, that's that upper left site, the level of stratigraphy is going to be very exciting. You're going to get a lot of potential range of time periods. If you land at site 2, we've seen a lot of talks already about the very large permanently shadowed region that's on the margin of this unnamed crater. Site 3 is a right there on the Gerlach rim, and that's a very bright, very small crater. So if you wanted a very young crater to investigate and answer science questions, right, that would be a potential landing site. And then even Site 4, right? So trying to understand how material is moved downhill in an area where we have so much ice and so many volatiles. So going from, I know that there's been, we're kind of asking the question of among the 13 landing sites, do you have a favorite? But then even within, or among the 13 landing regions, do you have a favorite? But even within that, there's another embedded question, which is within the landing sites, do you have favorites? Because there's a lot of science here that can be done. And I think the mapping really helps us show that. The next level of nested mapping that we would do, hopefully maybe by the next LSSW or a future league meeting, the next level that we'd want to do then is that extremely detailed mapping using NAC imagery where we can, where we don't have too many shadows, to try to get at what are the individual units that are within some of these potential landing sites. So next slide, please. I'll stop here on my summary slide. Nested maps, right? They help us make science decisions. That's really the focus of this talk. As an example, I've shown a couple of ones that I and some students have done over to Gerlach Crater Rim. Using these, we could potentially collect a really diverse suite of samples. We can trace units that we see on the global geologic map, try to track them into some of the landing site areas. We can build local stratigraphy, right, to understand what came first, what happened later. And then as I go through the SDT report, the Science Definition Team report for Artemis, nested mapping, I wish I could say that nested mapping supports all of the Artemis science goals, but really there are four that it contributes the most to. And those are things like understanding planetary processes, the origin and character of lunar polar volatiles, the impact history, right, where we have craters, and then investigating and mitigating exploration risks. I did not turn on all of the great slope maps and PSR maps. There's a lot of other maps that can get embedded into potentially a map cube. But here we kind of focused on geologic and geomorphic mapping. The images on the right, I'll leave you with these. These are some 3D scene images from ArcGIS showing our units draped across the Gerlach crater rim. And really looking forward to the summer LSSW that Sarah Noble mentioned, right? Looking at regional mapping and then also some local mappings that facilitate navigation. I'm 6 seconds over. Thank you, Julie.